World War I, Part 10. This will do it. We've concluded the war. Now we're going to see what happened after the war was over. All right. In January, like January 7th, 1918, the United States had declared war the previous April. We don't have large numbers of troops in France yet, but President Wilson went public with his what he called the Program for the Peace of the World. It has been known ever since, as the 14 points, because it consisted of 14 Roman numeral designated proposals. So, and I posted a little video about it, which is not very informative. Going to give you the general idea. The first 4 or 5 of them are closing the barn door after the cows are out, so to speak. World leaders are always preparing for the last war, and then the next one surprises them. So you had such things as freedom of the seas, no secret treaties, stuff like that, that addressed the things that had caused the current war. Then after that, you go into a lot of details about territorial changes that would relieve pressures. They were all aimed at what's called self-determination. Various ethnicities and so forth wanting to have their own territory and their own government. You had that, you had impartial adjustment of colonial claims, all of that. And the last one that bore the Roman numeral 14, Wilson called for the establishment of what he termed a League of Nations, an international organization which would provide a forum to work out international disputes short of war, and hence head off future conflicts. It's based on, and this is at least the third time I've said this, the assumption that the nations of the world desire peace above all things and will gravitate toward that solution if they can. So there should be fewer wars. Okay, Wilson had announced this. The Allied leaders saw it not as a blueprint. They actually opposed most of it because it would interfere with the arrangements they'd made. They'd seriously bribed the Italians to come in, and you got to honor that, they thought. But they printed up copies of it as leaflets and just, covered the Central Powers populated areas with these, leading the leaders of the Central Powers, mainly Germany, to think that the 14 points would actually become the basis for a non-vindictive peace, which is precisely what Wilson wanted. He wanted a non-vindictive peace where the leaders, where the winners don't gouge the losers and thus simply guarantee another conflict down the road. This he mainly wants to avoid that. Wilson, I think he had the flu himself, lived over it, and some say he never was really the same. He'd been very politically astute before he starts making some dumb mistakes. Congressional elections in 1918, just after the war is over, Wilson wanted it to be a referendum on his leadership, so he called upon the voters to elect Democrats. He was a Democrat, Democrats to Congress, and hopefully give him support in both houses. It would strengthen his hand in the peace negotiations. But there were too many people with too many grievances. In the 20th century and on like that, if the party in power, the party that has the White House, is going to just take a drubbing in congressional elections, it's going to be the midterms and the president's second term. That's what happened here. Republicans came out with majorities in both houses. Okay, there's going to be a peace conference in Paris in 1919. The United States is invited to send a 5-man delegation, and President Wilson appointed himself to head the delegation. He's also going to take along his advisor, Edward House, and 3 non-entities, no names. Because Wilson is like, please, I'd rather do it myself. He wants to do this. It's his baby. He's going to try to get it delivered. Now, he stiffed the Republicans because there were no mainline leading Republicans on the commission, and he stiffed the Senate. There are no senators. When anything he brings back from Paris will have to take effect, be ratified by a Republican-dominated Senate. By this time, he's built up some enmity. Political leaders all eventually learn that friends come and friends go, but enemies accumulate. Might want to remember that. So in January 1919, Wilson got on a ship and sailed off over to Europe. When he got there, he toured all the major cities, and just throngs of people, as far as the eye could see, turned out to just cheer themselves hoarse for Wilson, whom they saw, and he began to see himself as a kind of messianic figure who's going to be the savior of the world. He's the man with the plan that will release us from the curse of war for all time to come. So that doesn't make him feel more humble. The peace conference finally began. Oh, by the way, Wilson left the country. No president had ever left U.S. soil while in office before, except Theodore Roosevelt spent about a week on the Panama Canal construction site in the year 1906 and had his picture made sitting at the controls of a steam shovel. That was still U.S. flag soil. So this is unprecedented. And he's gone from January to June, with one brief return visit along about March. Okay. They tried to go by the plan of no open covenants of peace openly arrived at. Didn't work. There were four leaders: President Wilson of the United States, Prime Minister David Lloyd George is his last name, of Britain, Premier Georges Clemenceau of France, and the President of Italy was Vittorio Orlando. They did the deal. And Wilson had rented a house near Paris, and sometimes aides would peek in the door. Here you got four heads of state, heads of government crawling around on the floor with the maps spread out, arguing over stuff. Wilson had to give in on point after point after point of his 14 points. The Italians had been promised some things to get them into the war, and felt like those promises had to be kept, and Wilson got almost nothing of the 14 points. So it's very cynical. This thing was put out as bait to the Germans to get them to lay down their arms on faith that the 14 points would be the basis of a non-vindictive peace, and then it wasn't going to be the basis of anything. It was just a trick to get them to surrender. Okay, but Wilson did get the one thing he wanted most. Article 10 of the treaty was going to be the League of Nations. The nations that ratified the treaty would thus be joining the League of Nations. By the way, Germany was not invited to the peace conference. The French had been furious at the Germans the whole time for starting the war and invading them by surprise. And bottom line, the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 had 440 some odd provisions, and over 400 of them were punitive toward Germany. Worst of all was the war guilt clause. Germany has no choice but to sign this because its military had been reduced to almost nothing. It can't have an air force anymore. Its navy's down to nearly nothing. But Germany had to essentially sign a guilty plea where they accepted guilt for the war having occurred. Based on that, they're supposed to pay all the damages, called reparations, enough to keep the German economy crippled for generations to come. So French vindictiveness. Now, France is going to fall early the next time around in 1940, but I can't help but think, you know what? That's on them to a great extent, because the Germans' main thing that they come out of this with, they want revenge. They want somebody that can make them feel proud again, and they found him. Okay, so Wilson returned to the United States in the summer of 1919. Treaty in hand, it will need to be ratified by a 2/3 vote of the U.S. Senate, controlled by the other party. Now, most of the senators favored a treaty in some form. But there were some that just were so angry at Wilson, kind of like Democrats angry at Trump today. They're just not going to do anything he wants. They were called irreconcilables. And you had others who could go for it if you'd put some disclaimers in there. But as the summer went by, support in the Senate deteriorated. Worse and worse, it starts to look doubtful. So in September, the president decided to take his case directly to the people. Now, the way they've done that in the TV age is that they, block out a slot in the network TV and bring the cameras into the Oval Office, and the president sits at his desk and makes a speech while everybody watches ESPN. No, we don't watch that anymore, whatever else it might be. They didn't have that then. So Wilson chartered a train. Presidential train is going to travel from Washington, D.C. to the West Coast and back. And at every whistle stop, the president will come out in the back of the train and make a speech to the crowd that will gather. Sometimes he'll be making speeches in large auditoriums. All of that is trying to sell the treaty. Main selling point, that the treaty would give you a 90% guarantee against war. Now, what was objectionable about it? Language in the League of Nations, which looked like, and remember, we came out of this war thinking we'd been hornswoggled. We should never been in this thing. That's right after it was over. That might oblige us to participate in some future war that had nothing to do with our immediate interests. Just file that down. Put in a disclaimer. We can go with it. Wilson wouldn't do it. So Wilson he's in hell. Okay, he had a migraine that never let go. He can't keep food down. He can't sleep. He's making sometimes 12 speeches a day. His doctor had warned him. Wilson's blood pressure was astronomical his whole adult life. His doctor said, "You break down before you reach the Rockies." And Wilson's supposed to have replied, and this ought to give you goosebumps, "I don't care if I die the day the treaty is ratified." And he reminded the doctor that he, as commander-in-chief, had sent American soldiers into combat, and that over 120,000 of them had paid the ultimate sacrifice and not come home. And he believed that if that treaty doesn't get ratified, all of that is wasted. All of that is just flushed down the drain. And if he asked them to put their lives on the line, he cannot do less. There's a great deal not to like about Woodrow Wilson, but the guy's got him a backbone. I got to give him creds for that. He made it to the West Coast, started back, got to Pueblo, Colorado, and gave a very emotional speech, went back to his train and suffered a complete physical breakdown. The train highballed it as nonstop as a train could go back to D.C. They stuck him in the White House without telling the public diddly squat. And a few days later, he had a stroke, the nasty kind. He's bedridden, he's slobbering, he can't speak clearly. The president's wife, whom he had married, his first wife died in 1914. The second wife, she would go in and plead with him, if you just do this, and he'd, no. So with Wilson down and out, the Senate rejected the treaty, and the United States never joined the League of Nations. It's tempting to say that since Wilson said if we don't join the League of Nations, there will be another war within a generation. And there was another war within a generation when we rejected the League. Therefore, if we had just done what he said and accepted the treaty, we could have avoided World War II. I'm sorry, no, it was a valiant effort, but at the time when we would have needed to do anything to keep World War II from happening, American public opinion was extremely isolationist, extremely hostile. We wouldn't have done anything more than we actually did. And we do bear some of the blame for not being willing to pay the price of a small war to avoid a big one. That's going to do it for Unit 2. I hope you've watched all the videos. Sorry about that, but you do need to do that if you're going to be ready for Exam 2. Have a nice day.